Okay, so yeah, for 30 years, been involved in surveys, and I think, there's a number of things that have really frustrated me during that time. One is this sort of obsession with numbers. Leadership teams in particular seem to be obsessed with kind of chasing a number, particularly response rates. There's this really unhealthy obsession with response rates, and I'll share a story perhaps later if we have time that is a real eye opener for one organisation that was scoring some incredible response rates, but for all the wrong reasons. Also, just I guess really the theme for today is about turning data or feedback into positive change, positive action. And that's really critical. Surveys aren't about numbers, they're about listening with intent to act. And often we just end up under mountains of data, as James and Phil describe as the kind of white noise of data. You're just wading through this data, and we've all been there when you're involved in these, particularly the sort of old school annual surveys. There's then this period where you're traipsing through data. It takes an absolute age, and by the time you've kind of worked through all the data, analysed, prioritised it, you're 3-4 months down the line, and what was always going to be a snapshot in time is kind of completely out of date. So we need to get much more nimble in terms of how we respond, how quickly we respond to survey data, how often we survey, how we survey, and simplifying it and kind of cutting through the noise. So without further ado, let me introduce our two guests today, Phil Carpenter and James D'Souza. They're the co-founders of Treehouse Analytics, which was really set up with a mission to turn feedback into action, as simple as that. Both James and Phil come from primarily a marketing and customer data background. So they're bringing to this a kind of customer, an external perspective. And I think there's an awful lot we can learn from that world in terms of how we go about data capture, responding to data, presenting data, talking about and bringing data to life for our senior leaders, and so on. And those are the sort of themes that James and Phil are gonna get into. Without further ado, James, Phil, can I hand over to the two of you to get stuck into this wonderful theme, and perhaps do a slightly better job of introducing yourselves. Cheers.
That's okay. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Hopefully that's coming through okay to everyone. So hello again. We are James and Phil from Treehouse Analytics, and as Lee said, we were actually set up to try and bring together the need for sort of strategy that's led by data insights, but also kind of recognizes the human dynamics that go on in systems and in organizations. And we're bringing a sort of a customer experience background, if you like, into the people experience space. And it's there particularly in the employee surveying and engagement and the wealth of data there that we wanted to share some experiences with you today. I think because we know ourselves from having been leaders of teams and organizations we've worked in the past that the sort of typical engagement data and either the amount of it or the specificity in it for action can just be really difficult. It turns into a bit of a trial and error type affair, and we just wanted to share with you some of our learnings, approaches, work that we've done to help turn essentially that feedback into meaningful action that's relevant for your organization and your people. So today we're going to broadly be covering the topic of mindset and how to journey the leaders of the organization. We're going to be talking about interpreting the data in a sort of scalable, approachable way in order to guide action. We're going to be talking about ways of targeting effort for the maximum impact. And that's both in the analysis and in, therefore, the initiatives and actions that you take off the back of the surveys. And also, what it is to be able to set a survey with relevance to it that really gets to the heart of what matters for your people, specifically in your unique organization culture, how to ask questions that are actually relevant to what's going on for people at that moment in time. So I wanted to start with a sort of a step back, actually, to the broader context of engagement, and just flip up some stats, which I'm sure everyone's quite familiar with. The Gallups and Gartners and so on of this world that we all look to and say, well, the case for engagement is, of course, really strong. You've got this two sides to a coin thing of engaged employees are that much happier, that much more productive, and so on. And then through it could be through indicators like discretionary effort, of course, the business, the organization itself benefits massively. And that is being quantified and proven out in certain cases. So this sort of translation from what's good for the employee becoming what's good for the organization. And it gets really compelling. However,
yes. So, however, that's great, all well and good. So knowing this conceptually and making it happen in your unique business environment is a challenge. So listening to employees and hearing the drumbeat of what is happening in the business to develop a plan of action to create an environment where discretionary effort is the norm requires that we understand the root cause of what's observed through the data and not just look at specific data points. And we know what to do about it. That's appropriate in your business environment, not just some generic response. And we're able to prioritize, so target and focus efforts and resource by understanding the issues through the lens of their scale and importance, and which is really important and often really difficult to do. And therefore know where to start and be able to activate quickly, to Lee's point earlier, not sort of ruminate for 3 months, before actually being able to action anything. But what we believe is that the insight can be drawn upon to not only help realize just employee engagement, but it has strategic application across the broader areas. It informs connecting the broader people agenda, being able to track employee value propositions and other sort of initiatives, gather cultural insights, because this is not just a thing that sits separate to all your other sort of knowledge or insight gathering sort of opportunities within the business. And also, it's an opportunity to narrate and evidence the business case, and plus track and measure initiatives, if done properly. So cultivating insight that homes in on these challenges and starts facing into these outcomes is what we're going to focus on today. And we'll talk about what to do, how to do it in a way that saves you time and effort. So that's our intention for today's session.
Thanks, Phil. So before we get into the sort of the juicy stuff around the data and all the good analytics, we actually wanted to cover off sort of our philosophy, I suppose. So we talk about data a lot, of course we do. And today, in essence, we are talking about data, except we're sort of not, because what we're actually really talking about is the journeying of mindsets. We're talking about the design, a kind of a more thoughtful design for the way that we listen to employee voice and what we hear in that. And we're talking about a broader, more powerful cultural value, cultural insight value that arises from collecting any kind of employee voice type data, be it engagement or otherwise. There is always an opportunity to kind of keep a finger on and tap into the cultural signals of the organization. And I suppose what we would do is distill that into 3 tenets, this sort of direction of travel in these 3 tenets of, if we were to only ever think about engagement as a score, as it so often gets talked about, then of course that's all it will ever be. It will not become the opportunity to understand, like I was saying, understand culture and build really sort of productive and healthy employee experiences. If we don't recognize that engagement is actually informed by many moments of interactions, it's this always existing thing, it's interactions going on all the time within a system of an organization, then often actually engagement we've found, gets thought about as actually an indictment of a particular leader. It's a manager's responsibility to improve the engagement of their team, the score of their team, when in fact it's more systemic than that. And thirdly, it's actioning the insight from this has to come from recognizing that the insight is a sum of many parts. It can't be brought down successfully to an individual score, to an individual question that then gets focused attention, or that these are the bottom 3 performing, let's focus on those. Those are a function of the connection between many more things than that.
So in essence, we believe shifting mindset is important, and I'm really passionate about this, that we move from employees telling leadership what needs to be fixed to the collective recognition that there's an opportunity to improve our working environment and shape that together. And I think it's a real mindset shift from what we've experienced in any case. And in fact, in some conversations we've had with leadership and excos, they've suggested that they actually don't complete the survey. They said, well, no, I mean, we shouldn't redo this. And I mean, it just in our view, that sends out completely the wrong message. It's all about our environment. We are all us doing it, rather than it being them asking us to complete something so that they can do something for us back. I'm just absolutely passionate about that shift in mindset that needs to happen in order that we can all get the best value out of engagement surveys and recognize them for the forum and the voice that it gives to the people in the organization. I'm going a little bit off piste here.
Now, before we get into it proper, there was mention of a poll earlier. We would love to hear your view actually on a particular thing about your own journey on driving insight and action out of your employee engagement data. So I think there's a question. Great, there's a poll coming up. The question's all there.
Excellent.
People should have access to be able to answer this. We'd love to get the view here. Okay.
Okay, I can see lots of people voting, and it's quite interesting. So I'll be sharing that in a moment. Got about half the people have voted so far.
And what's really pleasing is the pattern of responses is nearly what we hoped and predicted would be the case.
Yeah, I expected slightly more of a bell curve, but it's interesting. I mean, our conversation today will, in essence, be about moving from that very difficult, hopefully, and discussing some of the pitfalls and providing helpful tips, to making it a little bit more straightforward. I mean, easy is a big ask, right? Yeah, it's really moving closer to 5. So, but even if you are closer to that 5, I think we're hoping that we're going to be raising points that identify opportunities where that good insight offers for broader applications across the people agenda, and sort of be used in a sort of from a broader perspective. So
yeah, that's it. I think that's all the votes we're getting in. So there you go. The majority of people were sort of somewhere in the middle, or finding it difficult, very difficult.
Yeah, and it's not surprising, and it's sort of from what we sort of seen and experienced. There's something about the way the data is collected and the way it's looked at and the way it's thought about that actually puts it in that more difficult category than it needs to be, I think, really. So shall we sort of, if we go on, are we able to just close that off the screen? Is that off the screen? Okay, just click there. Okay.
Yeah, it shouldn't be.
I'm going to talk about a bit about this. It's a bit of a journey. So I know it's really important to recognise you're going on a journey. Know where you're starting from. Really critical, and bring everyone with you on the way. And I'm going to talk about it by referencing experience we had with the client. It's about 4 years ago now. hopefully I'm going to I've sort of made some notes on this story, so hopefully I don't I sort of narrate it as well as I can. His client is FS client, multi-million-pound business, several hundred employees, and it was growing. They were looking to move from a single once-a-year questionnaire, sort of 70+ questions, sort of very standard, sort of traditional, many pages of tables, and sort of an aggregated engagement score that they worked to. It's not unusual, at the time in the past, and they recognised that this has not given them what they needed to move the engagement dial, which in their position of growth and sort of being successful, they recognised they needed to sort of have a step change in engagement, and they wanted to have that more frequent finger on the pulse, shorter surveys, which would be much more helpful. And we ran first pulse survey, and we'll talk more about this in upcoming slides about the actual specifics of the surveys, but at this moment just sort of was honing in on the journey we went with them. But for now, just know that we don't focus on multiple charts, we don't focus on year-on-year sort of stats and sort of doing these very close sort of comparisons of 70 different questions. We seek out the headlines experience employees were playing back. So again, which we'll talk about in more detail, but we were sort of focusing on uncovering, even if I can say it, some early indicators of the business growing pains, things that would be helpful, that they could do something that would help improve engagement, rather than sort of knowing the scores, looking at sort of what's going on within teams, what their numbers are and whether they've gone up or down. And we were able to uncover, and sort of not unusual in a business that's growing, that some of the sort of the points that were coming through, the narrative that was coming through, was not knowing who does what, as the sort of business needed to change to address this growth. And there were pockets of resource shortages which were impacting people's positivity towards engagement. Again, not unsurprising, but when we presented this to the Exco and surfaced these and how these linked to they knew they were using EMPS rather than engagement score or something, but effectively sort of the same sort of this score, so that we could sort of then talk to them about these different groups within the business. We were not showing them these tables. We were talking about this sort of narrative flow, and they were used to viewing tables. They were used to identifying sort of, well, what's the top score, what's the lowest score, or who's the good team, who's the bad team, and we were met with some confusion, to be honest. And this is the Exco, and we were sort of our first foray into this, and they were. What had happened was what we presented looked very different and provided insight, not data, and it was different to how people had historically been consuming and assessed the engagement results. And it wasn't that in the session that they disagreed with what we were uncovering and what it was enabling them to do, but it was just different. And I still remember the CEO's comment. We said, oh sorry, she said to us, she said, there's a lot to unpack here, isn't there? Which sort of it was a real learning for us, and we'd come in with some assumptions and where we knew they wanted change, but we'd probably gone too far. We had to step back and walk through what we could uncover and what was now possible because they were taking this different approach. We had to help introduce the thinking that the insight we uncovered provided multiple layers of application. So rather than just focusing on the scores, we were able to provide insight that helped point them towards organizational design opportunities, or talked about how they could focus on flexible working policy, or how their team could interact differently. So there was these different layers that were coming through, which they not talked about or not, they hadn't thought about it, but in the sort of conversation about engagement surveys, it wasn't where they were at, and we needed to actually have met them where they were. It was a sort of an error on our part, as it were, and it was something we learned from. We were able to walk them through. We started sort of pre-survey collaboration, uncovering sort of the hypothetical pre-poll sort of survey sort of challenges that they might have that we could explore and listen to, and our analytics could focus on. And we helped them move away from reviewing the scores and tables so that they could pay attention to the business challenges. We stepped back rather than providing, walking through sort of, I can't even remember how many tables they originally presented in that first survey we reviewed. But stripping it back to just focusing on the narrative. So yes, of course, as a business, they needed some quick headline numbers. That was okay. And we said, okay, well, let's have a two-step process. We'll share that back, but we'll also have a session where we work through with you guys. These are some of the insights we're uncovering. Which do we want to explore more deeply so that we can help you as a business get better understanding and do some decisioning on? And then we came back with that narrative, rather than a pack or a deck, but help come back with, and here's the insight it gives you so that you can do something about it. And thus keeping it really meant that we were able to shift towards storytelling and not just provide tables just because we learned stuff. We could have provided a gazillion tables, but it's not important to share what you've heard. It's important to share what you've learned. It was a real learning. Otherwise, you really will create a wall of white noise that makes their challenge even harder. And I think another sort of point about that journey, it wasn't just about the people that we were presenting back to and engaging with, but it was helping the people in the employees in the business to understand that they were going on a journey. There was this the engagement survey was shifting, and to the point I was making earlier, that it was moving away from a you tell we do to a it's our journey together to improve our workplace, and it's a forum to have your voice heard and for us to pay attention and respond to what is being said, which then all of a sudden it within itself starts to sort of iterate this, wow, it's a better experience, I'm feeling valued and heard, and all of a sudden you're starting in itself having that conversation. You're changing the mindset of your people about how the organization is operating. Well, I suppose as it's how it's operating. It's not a do and a tell. It's a we and us together, and it's sort of providing people with an opportunity to shape the world that they're operating in.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really helped over time with that particular client and the connections is the storytelling piece around the data, is being able to help educate as we go, because I mean all of these things aren't just a kind of rolling out of insight, they are sort of an intervention in amongst themselves. So being able to sort of teach how to do the storytelling from the data that they always were used to looking at, and how therefore the value of that data can take on a new value for them, and that's something which it's taken time, but I can kind of see really sort of clicking in now with that particular client. And so in terms of the way that we kind of go about doing all of this and the framework and the approach that we follow, I think this, for me, actually all kind of comes back to a role I was in years ago. So as a people leader, as a leader of a team, and I was sitting on a people panel, as you have in a company, which of course my background was a data company, ironically, for the ability to not actually work with this data. And we're having one of the sessions you do every year to review the feedback and decide what we're going to do with the points that are being raised. And there's always some HR representation, of course, in the room, which means you've got policy there which says, okay, that's off the salaries off the table, pay reviews, these things off the table. The list gets whittled down, and naturally you end up with the kind of and this was a real case. Well, okay, there aren't enough teaspoons in the kitchen, apparently. So that makes its way onto the list of these are the things we're going to take away from. Now, no one in the room at that moment saying this is going to improve engagement, but that's what they're doing with the data that's in front of them. Is okay, we need to put more teaspoons in the kitchen, and that is not to say that that might not have been a problem, or the classic case of, you know, fruit bowls on a Tuesday or what have you. You know, there are people that will need and want, and that's all kind of good stuff to have. But it kind of becomes a bit of a game of whack-a-mole in a way, in that it becomes that list of things to do because people have said it in the survey, and because it was all collected as part of engagement, we then forget, you know, we naturally assume that's going to drive engagement, and then sort of forget that that's not really what it's about, and kind of it's the connection. So if I think back to that same organization that I was working in the years running up to that point, we were growing massively, and it was quite busy and stressful at times, actually. But engagement was always really high, and I don't seem to remember anybody mentioning teaspoons, you know, in the years up to that point. And it becomes something which it becomes that we're doing engagement, and that for us is where we get quite passionate about. You know, people use the phrase, well, you said we did, and often the comms that go, you said we did. Well, the you said we did becomes the fruit bowls and the teaspoons and what have you. It becomes the discrete actions that are completely isolated from the culture and the real lived experience of people, because they are the sum of thousands, hundreds of thousands, depending on the size of the organization. They are the sum of all these individual assumptions that we all carry and hold about what we think the most helpful thing to do is. Because the question in the survey basically says, what do you need us to do for you? Back to Phil's point about them and us, the leadership and the colleagues, and the, you know, you said we did. And that's when you get this kind of the one-on-ones being added up to just equal more and more fruit over time, which ironically, of course, is never really enough fruit. And so what we do, and where we've kind of learned is a brilliant point to start, is to really tap into and sort of take on the idea of really trying to use your questioning and your understanding through the data to understand how people really feel about their current experience at work, and to get them to describe what for them is both enabling and inhibiting a positive experience of being at work. And somewhat related to that is another case at a client where we were actually able to use engagement data to help add a lens to the rollout of some employee value proposition EVP initiatives, where because of the kind of more emotional engagement type approach that we were taking with the survey, and then by peppering in some questions that allowed us to track sort of impact and the reception of the EVP initiatives, we're able to demonstrate something which actually otherwise wouldn't typically have been possible, where we're able to say, yes, all your EVP related questions are scoring high, but we are able to see from the data that there is no correlation, there is no particular discernible link between those EVP things being done well and these red thread, as we were calling with our client, these engagement factors improving. There's just no hard and fast connection between them. Now, pulsing about the EVP initiatives on their own in a fairly traditional way would have told them that people were quite happy with them and so on, and things would have carried on as is. But the level of insight we were able to bring in was to actually make a rich and proper connection between, so in this case, learning and development particularly, and the notion of me feeling invested in and developed and therefore valued by the organization, and what that means to me because of the open text questioning and so on that we were able to put in order to inform the L&D part of the EVP and the career development part of the EVP with a much more meaningful, impactful level of insight.
Cool. So with connections being the watchword, we achieve this by using this model as a framework. And so, in reality, people implicitly make these connections when they're forming an opinion of how they feel about working somewhere. And it's based on the idea that there are layers of understanding required to drive this kind of insight needed to drive action. So I think you have the measure of engagement. So that could be NPS, or that could be sort of a percentage favorable responses. Either way, it's an outcome a myriad of other factors. So we work with these factors in layers, and in order that sort of it sort of pulls together sort of an understanding of what's sort of shaping that view. And the sort of layer just below is the emotional indicators layer. These are sort of your emotional engagement, which so that we can determine these factors sort of by isolating some of these sort of these factors, which are like, where do you feel valued or heard or listened to or supported, and which are which are then informed by or linked to sort of the rational levers. And these connect as a driver of that feeling are the sort of the day-to-day things that are impacting how you feel. And I think if I could sort of give an example, if I was playing back let's say an ENPS score, or sort of providing a comment about a company, I might say, I would recommend this company, so I'm going to give it a 9 or 10, so it gets a real high NPS. The reason why I give that, because I have this emotional, I feel valued when I work at this organization. And the reason why I feel that way is because my manager supports me, he listens to me, the people I work with will support me in the work I do, and that the systems are in place are there that enable me to feel this way. So it just these three layers, they layer up to support the reason why I'm providing that engagement score. And if we don't connect those layers, then we're not able to get that understanding. And if we treat those layers individually, and especially those rational sort of levers that James was referring to, it's often where people go, where they say, okay, well, let's take the five worst performing scores, hand them out to the teams where they're the lowest scoring, and help get them to crack on and try and resolve that. It's the wrong place to start. It just completely misunderstands the relationship, the strength of engagement. Yeah. So I'll stop there. Otherwise, I'll.
So yeah, we've found that focusing on the idea of emotional engagement to be one of the most powerful things that we've done since working to I suppose breathe new life into the data that's collected from these, because of its ability to unlock. So typically where surveys focus on these these things we think rationally about, and think being the key word there. You ask people what they think, they're going to tell you what they think is the problem, and therefore what they think is the solution. And I suppose in the same ways you might try and appeal to a child that's upset about something. Actually, what you want to do is steer the conversation to genuinely how you feel, because that, as a mode of putting someone into the mode of self-reflection, is kind of intervention in itself, and you get richer data out of it. So the difference, for example, between, I think our processes are clumsy and inefficient and our technology is rubbish, and that might or might not actually have a negative impact on engagement. Often we see companies that are, it's really busy, stressful, and these things are hard, actually may still have particularly high engagement. It will be some other feeling really by a certain cohort that's dragging the engagement score down, because I think our processes are clumsy, might impact engagement or not. I feel frustrated and nearly angry when I'm working with, when I've got the tools I've got to be able to work with other teams. Well, that's way more likely to negatively affect overall engagement. And by focusing on how you tap into those and read those emotional indicators will make that visible in the data. And to sort of start to try and walk you through that and the layers and the kinds of things we might see from it, a relevant point here before Phil sort of steps us through these layers is we totally recognize that we're talking about a framework and a way of thinking and a model to working with this that, that we've landed on. We know there are loads out there. There are loads of potential frameworks and ways of doing this. And what I've noticed is that with all those different models and framework, often comes the advice of, well, you take parts and do what's right for your organization, and then you iterate based on your unique culture. And what we found is, well, you're very quickly left with the question of, but how? How would you know what the culture is there really because that kind of assumed anecdotal version isn't necessary. The power of data, of course, is to kind of give you the evidence. How do we know what the culture is, and therefore the most relevant questions to ask? And so there's obviously, there's the gap there, and that gap is, is completely where we live. And actually what we found is that by starting a journey like this with a pulse that's much more focused towards those emotional type indicators, is that you get such an insight on the real lived experience and culture of the organization that you can then shape a listening program that starts to be so much more relevantly targeted to the what matters for your people, and the real challenges and opportunities that are at play in your organization at this particular moment in time, and I suppose a much more systemic view of things. And the questions then, as I was saying, promote this kind of self-reflection. They become intervention. They get even people that are answering these surveys to think differently about the traditional kinds of responses that they would have given, where, oh, I'll tell you what's wrong. They become a lot more open, so that then when you ask the open-ended questions around, well, what is it that inhibits and enables you to have a positive experience at work? Actually, you get data, you get responses and data that's so much more behavior, that sort of attitudinal, talking about the behaviors in the organization, that you then, of course, get to tap into the relevance comes from having an insight into that behavior. And of course, with culture being, we like to describe culture as the way things are done here, that is what you're getting from the data. And so, we do that through these more emotional indicator leaning questions, the I feel valued, I feel supported, I feel, trusted, that sort of thing. But we also use, yes, the open-ended questions. Phil will talk a bit more about those. But we also use a technique, it's a common technique used in other other environments, where ask people to describe their experience of working there in 3 words. And we've found that actually give people the opportunity to describe what it's like to work there in 3 words. We've had some great data over time for that. And by doing the kind of semantic analysis that we're able to do on that, what you're then able to do is put such rich language to the lived experience of people in an organization, where you are then actually able to start, well, for one, just actually describing the experience in words that means something. When you talk to senior leadership, when we go back to Exco and SLTs and so on, being able to say the experience in your business is there are people that are tired and frustrated. There are people that have a stimulating and fulfilling role. These are all words that have come because of the analysis of the words that their people are using. We can put a language to it that means something. We can, although those are qualitative descriptions, we can actually track that over time, of course, because not that we're saying, right, today people are this stimulated and fulfilled, and next time they're this stimulated and fulfilled. What we're actually able to do is say, the language has changed. So we had one working with one people leader actually of a credit risk function in an organization, gone through a change, transformation, big change to the OD. And through the language that people were using, we were able to track this journey from, oh God, this is really scary, I don't know where this is going, to, oh God, I get where this is going, we just don't have what we need to be able to do it, and it's really stressful, through to, I kind of get it, and it's starting to become more manageable. So we were tracking that experience with people, but using their words and being able to play that back to leadership. So it does allow us to sort of measure and track the sort of impact and change to things over time as well, and bring leaders more into that feeling of we're all in this, we're all trying to improve this for all of us.
Cool. So this sort of layered sort of diagram sort of brings to life that sort of conceptual model. And what we do is we link the different layers. So we've linked the eNPS score, we've linked the in 3 words groups that sort of give us a view on creating their experience. We've got their scores and their feelings, and we've got these sort of open text responses that we've been able to categorize and scale and understand how big they are. And because they're linked to eNPS, we now know how important they are as well. And because they're all linked, we're able to interrogate the data through different lenses. We can start with looking at EMPS. And in this example, you'll see that we've noted potential promoters on the top left-hand side of the diagram, and that's because these were not the 9, 10 recommends. These were the 7, 8 close to recommending. What was their profile? And we can look at the profile of all those people that were just nearly about the potential promoters, and understand what it is that's helping them be that high. So they're enabled by that really good support from their team, good life balance, good trust. And at the same time, understand what's inhibiting those people. So there's something that they're not working well together. There's some sort of workload imbalance. There's some system issues which could be then addressed for the employees that are falling within this group. So all of a sudden, we know who they are. We start to understand what how important these things are to these groups, and we're able to sort of target them with where they are and the actions that are going to help move them on. This is a million miles from the here's the scores for your team. Hey, team leader, you've got a poor score, you're not doing very well, can you fix your team? What we're able to do is we're able to recognize that, hey, that team that's got a challenge, what's coming through is there's an imbalance of workload coming into that department, say for example, that is coming from elsewhere. There's actually, the challenge for that department is not the fact that they're being misled or not being looked after within the team. It's the function of the system that's affecting the experience that team's having. By connecting the data in this way, we're able to get under the skin of that, and therefore help sort of the broader, address the real challenges that are occurring within the business. And whilst for this example, we've come at it from potential promoters, you could just as easily start by saying, okay, where are the, so we've got inhibited by not working well together. What if we took all the people that fall within that category that have said the thing that's most inhibiting me is not working well together, and then we can interrogate them through that lens. Which departments are they in? How are they feeling? What impact is that having on how the experience that they're expressing that they're having within the organization? So the connected insight gives us this really powerful tool that allows us to sort of interrogate the real sort of challenges within the business.
Yeah, and we've had instances, it could be the classic, oh, our systems are rubbish. I mean, you hear that in so many places, complaints about systems, but by talking about it in a more systemic way, and for example, teams working well together, we've had it where there'll be these kind of slight aha moments with the leaders of those teams where they're saying, oh, actually, it's because those two teams both use different ends of that system, and I'm pretty sure that team don't actually really understand or have a clear understanding of how that team uses that end of the system, and we should probably do something, whereas if that manager was targeted on their engagement score, you wouldn't get that sort of connection. So what we say that the insight that we need from this, actually there's a few different things going on, but by getting that kind of emotional indicator driven, what's the real pulse of the of your people and the the culture, then allows us to ask the kind of rational type questions that we need to track we're going to have time with the manager, am I clear on the strategy, those sorts of questions. And then it becomes really important about how we look for connections within those. But we get to those rational questions. So one of the first things I'd say quickly though, before talking any more about connections, which is Phil's favorite word of today, is actually when we get into those rational questions, I'd say don't be afraid to just out and out ask people what is most important to them. Now, it kind of sounds a bit odd versus what I was saying earlier, because people think they know what the problem is. But actually what you're doing, you're asking what's important to them, not because, oh, so therefore that's the thing I need to fix. but it's brilliant insight into the window that people look through, the kind of where they're expecting, the experiences where they're expecting good engagement to show up. If you ask them, and we had the case of, oh, well, mutual respect, the amount of respect that people show each other, that's really important. And this technology thing is really important. Now, the thing about showing respect for each other is actually, that's not because people are coming in and being, contentious and setting out on their days to annoy each other. It's actually because of a whole connection load of things going, some of many different parts that's causing this kind of friction between the teams. Okay, so we will find out what those really important factors are by looking at the connections. But we know, no matter what then, that for people to score engagement or ENPS higher, they need to see that manifest through an increase in respect. Okay, that's really important to know, but we're not going to solve respect. We're not going to go in and say, right, you be more respectful. We're going to understand what's sitting underneath the surface.
So connections. Okay, so I mean, but look, by analysing which questions correlate with others, we can identify the key drivers of the engagement outcomes and the factors your people most want to see improved. So what that chart shows, I love this chart. People don't have to worry about it, but it shows the correlations between individual. Now we've actually moved them around for anonymity, but these shows how close each of these questions correlate. They always end up grouping together, so that you sort of engagement outcomes, working culture type outcomes, and what I can tell you is, and I'm not sure if it shows it necessarily in this one, but in that point that James was making earlier about the employee value proposition, all the activities that were being done for that, they scored well, but they didn't correlate well with engagement outcome, not because they weren't really important things, they weren't as important as other factors that we were able to uncover. Not surprisingly, factors like workload, factors like flexibility and being supported, especially in a very busy environment. People nearly didn't have time for the value proposition initiatives because they were too busy trying to crack on and get their job done. And looking at the sort of data points like this in groups enables us to not get sucked into individual questions, but looking at sort of groups which then sort of focus on a theme like work culture that can be addressed and handled, that we start to see, work culture is very closely correlated with engagement. Therefore, it's something that we need to work harder on rather than panicking too much about sort of another thing that's not as closely correlated. And so we have these correlations, and then with the overlaying these key themes arising with with the themes that come through from the open-ended questions, gives us the why behind the what, which is sort of I'll give you an example. So when we worked with one company, flexible working was something, I mean, I know, working from home, flexible working is a real sort of nut that a lot of people are trying to crack at this point in time. And this business were really keen to get everyone back into the office. But we interrogated this. So we had a question about flexible working, and when we sort of interrogated it, what we uncovered was this wasn't about working from home. This was about being trusted in doing the job that you wanted to do. So when we looked at the why, the feedback from their open text responses, we were able to learn that this is about not being micromanaged. This is about having some flexibility in your hours. This is about, let me just do my job and don't sort of keep on top of me, which completely shifted the policy focus around flexible working and really enabled the business to do something that could have truly positive impact on the experience within the organization, rather than the sort of a sort of sledgehammer of working from home conversation, which was not the conversation people worried about. In fact, what did come through was the challenges of cross-team working when people weren't in the office. So we were able to sort of start to initiate conversations around how to embrace the challenge of different teams not being in the office at different times. We're able to do that because we have this sort of this connected view and this holistic view of the data, rather than honing in on trying to solve individual questions. So I think
I'm going to skip some. I wanted to have a couple of minutes of questions. So hopefully this has been quite a skim over some topics, and we could talk all day about them. But I suppose to sort of distill that down to some key takeaways from this, I'd say start by thinking about the particular mindset journey you think you might need to go on at your organization. What's right for your business at this moment in time, and its leadership and their preoccupations and where they're at, and thinking about engagement then not as a score but as a forum, if you like, for the voices to be heard and to shape the experience together. I'd say, of course, meet the leaders and understand their preoccupations, meet them where they are, and bring them with you.
And then sort of looking at asking questions relevant to your organisation. So have that pre-survey thought about what areas and what challenges you're trying to focus on. Think about the language which is relevant to your people, and get on and hopefully you've started to sort of hear the whole getting under the skin of what people mean when they say something. We did a whole thing on leadership development around that, about sort of developing a bespoke program that sort of related to the challenges and inhibitors and enablers that were going on within an organization. Really sort of fascinating stuff. Stick to this. So chase understanding, not scores. I think, look, it's hunt the insight in the connections, don't focus on isolated scores, and then play back the narratives, distill this into a cohesive narrative of a few points made well, and not an exhaustive data regurgitation of what you've heard from people. I've tried to sort of whiz that through as much as possible. Hopefully,
thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. Thank you, Lee and Katie, for hosting.
Thank you, James, Phil. That was great. There was so much there that really resonated with me. Love the sort of the teaspoons in the kitchen thing. We've all been there, and who hasn't had fruit bowls appear around offices as the result of some sort of survey data over the years. I love the piece around 3 words. I don't know whether that's a technique that anyone else on who's dialed in has used, but that strikes me as super powerful. Eliciting the real words rather than sort of leading the horse to water, actually letting employees choose the words that encapsulate the culture for them, their reality. That strikes me as really super powerful. And again, I take away very much from the session that it's not, there's the numbers, the kind of metrics part of this actually, but an awful lot of the really rich actionable stuff is in that sort of open-ended, more qualitative output.
And do you know what we've found that in 3 words has been particularly useful for is people might get worried about survey responses that report a sort of a busy, stressful, tiring type experience, but because of the way we work with the data, is we're able to ascribe we're able to categorize each person and their response to a grouping of those 3 words. And that kind of busy, stressful, tiring in this one particular instance didn't necessarily, as a group, didn't necessarily score that much lower on the NPS. Yet the group that were categorized by talking about a chaotic type experience, they had a very negative NPS score as a group. And therefore, we're able to look at the other topics they raised, the other issues, the other scores they gave, and say, look, people are going to be busy. Of course, everyone talks about being busy. Everyone today has got to do more with less. But these people over here having to chaotic, don't know what's going on. That was somewhere to really focus. really get relevant.
Absolutely. Katie, I think we have a question from the
Yeah,
group.
I was just going to say we are at time now, so I know that some people won't be able to stick around, but we do have a question in the chat, and I want to make sure that we have at least one question answered. So,
Yeah.
Lizzie, when issues identified are factors like pay, systems, etc., which can take time to mobilize, aren't easily influenced, how can you maintain that engagement with surveys and avoid survey fatigue or inaction fatigue?
So one thing I'd say about survey fatigue, well, I understand that the issue's been raised here, but one thing particularly that we talk to clients about survey fatigue is we believe it's kind of not so much fatigue with surveys as fatigue with things not being done. Now, I hear some of those things will be longer burns, and we have this where we'll say, yeah, okay, therefore the frequency at which we're listening out for certain things is really important. Now, it is okay to oscillate between that rational lever type inspection, which is where these systems pay, those sorts of things are, and then the emotional indicators. And I think people will always have patience for being able to take that moment to say, this is what it feels like working. I don't feel valued. And then sort of you sort of oscillate between those, but make sure, again, this isn't just about collecting data as a kind of as a way of engaging with the business. There's always internal comms teams. There's comms off the back of it. There are town halls. There are written comms. There's loads of channels and campaigns. We work to try and help point out the ways in which those could be connected. And you say it, Phil. Often it's about just make sure to remind in those communications this is what you've heard. Just playing it back in the human way that you get from this sort of data when you make the connections from it. There's a patience, I think, that comes from people when they get that you've heard them properly.
And I think to add to that, and I know pay is what pay is, but the reality is pay is viewed differently when people feel as if they're valued, feel as if they got an input, they feel as if they're people are paying attention to them, they feel linked with the work, and they think, my God, this is great work, I love it. It's a bit annoying they don't pay me as much, but and we can see that in the data. I mean, if people aren't paid enough, they're not paying up. You can't necessarily do something about it. But there are so many other elements around that can be talked about and talked to. And also being quite upfront and candid and saying these are the things that we're addressing. These are the things we're hearing. How can we together all resolve these things? I'm such a believer that we are all responsible for our area, and I think the leaders need to let the business know that it's a culture of we will try and shape this, and they really need to back it up. Is kind of what I'd say, but that's not an insight thing. That's just a personal view.
Thank you. That's brilliant. We are right time. In fact, we're slightly over time. Lee, I'll hand over to you to wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. So many questions. I think we'll take the conversation offline, guys, but really enjoyed that session. Very much on the same page as us, particularly getting under the skin of emotions, not just the heads but the hearts part of this, and that emotions being the kind of at the heart of employee experience, really. So powerful stuff. Very much on the same page in terms of your philosophy and your approach to this. And thank you so much for the insight today.